Yeah, people often ask me about Warhammer Fantasy and how it all started, and I mean the story's been told quite a few times, but really the idea was that we just wanted to sell more toy soldiers. We were, and I say we, I mean Citadel Miniatures in Newark, we were selling mixtures of fantasy figures to people who were playing role-playing games. So our ranges were adventurers and monsters and such like. But we noticed that people were starting to buy entire regiments of models, especially orcs and goblins, things like that. And I think it was probably Brian who thought, well, people are obviously buying these things with an intention of playing a more conventional war game. And we initially thought, well, why don't we just make up a game and include it as part of our mail order flyers? Because at the time, every month we sent out mail order flyers to all of our established customers. And these were A3 sheets, I think. And we thought, yes, that's a great idea. So we asked Richard Halliwell to design a game. But in the process of designing that game, I think it grew, you know, as in Tolkien, the tale grew in the telling. And by the time it got properly commissioned, I think the intention was already to publish something that was a book. So the idea of it being a free mail order giveaway, which has become part of the great mythology of Warhammer, was a momentary thing, really. I think we quickly realised that what we had on our hands was a publishing enterprise. Now, we didn't have much in the way of equipment in those days to publish, so the very first Warhammer was actually produced on what was actually a word processing machine, a glorified typewriter. But that was something which we bought specifically to do publishing projects with. It was a Rank Xerox 860 for those who are interested in old technology. Great thing it was. And we set up a small studio in a place just around the corner from our factory in Newark. It was on Millgate. And there's me and Tony Ackland, and we basically did the first Warhammer. Eventually, it can't have been very long, but we were joined by John Blanche, and John helped us. I think it was probably from Forces of Fantasy onwards. May even have been a little later. I remember John sitting in the corner of the office with his repeatograph, just kind of dotting, dot, 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 and drawing pictures, black and white. Everything had to be what we call line art, which is black and white, no shading. For reprographics, we didn't have the means to do a kind of proper reproduction at that time. So yeah, and it was all very. It seemed like very quick at the time, and it can't have taken as much longer than a few months to put the first Warhammer together. And it does show, to be honest. But nonetheless, it sold very well. People enjoyed it, and we quickly decided to do a second edition rather than a reprint. I think we realised that the first one, which had been done very quickly and not produced terribly professionally, because as I say, there were only the two of us, and we were working under some pressure. We had to do all of the catalogues and mail order stuff as well. So we very quickly did a second edition, and I think that was done from, it might have been done from our Eastwood office, where we'd moved to shortly afterwards. Yeah, I think it was very much on the cusp, I think. And the second edition was really just a cleaned up version of the first one. I took that. I think Hal had disappeared at that point. Hal always disappeared. Hal didn't work for us full time in the early days. He basically had an itinerant life where he worked for a number of games companies doing mold making, including Citadel at one point.
Is this Richard Halliwell, sorry?
Yeah, Richard Halliwell.
Cool.
And Hal, he was one of these people who didn't much like to be tied down to a 9-to-5 job. he liked to get some money together and then go off travelling. And he went to places like Africa and South America, as well as the Far East. He was quite a well-travelled soul, was Hal. And considering he was quite young as well, I think he went to Africa when he can't have been much older than in very early 20s, sort of 21, 22 maybe. So Hal wasn't there, so I basically did the second edition, and it was really just a tidied up version. I think we got a steer from the customer base by then of what was wanted, because the first version did include quite a bit of role-playing material. By the time we got to the second edition, we realised that people weren't very interested in the role-playing material as such. What they wanted was to play battle games. So it was just a question of tidying up that system and expanding it out a little bit, updating it because the model range had changed. The brief for the first edition of Warhammer was that it had to have rules in for everything we made. Well, of course, we made everything under the sun at the time because it was a role-playing range. So that really became a little bit more focused. We started to do figures specifically for the tabletop wargame, and the second edition reflects that. And I seem to remember I don't think we produced a specific version of the army list for the second edition. I don't think that came out until we did the third. Yeah, but that saw us through to for a good while. It was the same format as the first one, box set with 3 books in it. The reason we did that is because it's actually easier to publish more than anything else. The artwork for it was done by either John or John Blanche or Tony Ackland. And by the time we got to the third edition, I think we'd changed quite substantially. The company had grown a lot. We'd moved again. We started off at Newark, as I say. We moved to Eastwood, I think 84, something around there. And then we moved again to, the studio moved again to Enfield Chambers on Low Pavement in Nottingham, opposite Marks and Spencer's. In fact, opposite the post office next to Marks and Spencer's. But, and that was a much bigger arrangement. I think we had 3 or 4 floors of a building, and we had all the painters on the bottom. There was a kind of next level up was some management offices, and then we had the games designers on the next floor, and the writers. And then on the top floor we had the production office. I seem to remember all the figure designers when they did move in were on that top floor in a big room at the end. I can't remember where the artists were. They must have been there somewhere, possibly on the middle floor. But so it was quite big, and we employed quite a good sized number of staff. We had specific staff to do production, of which there must have been about up to 10, about half a dozen to 10. And they were all sort of what we call finished artists in those days. So they were doing physical paste up artists, taking pictures. We actually had we bought our first large format camera to do pictures of toy soldiers with at that time and things like that. And by now we'd got a photomechanical tracker or bromide camera, so we could actually use pencil art with shading, and we could reduce that to a format that we could use using the camera. And we employed a whole bunch of guys from TSR. These were UK TSR staff who they more or less left en masse. I think TSR was breaking down. The UK version of TSR was breaking down at the time. TSR, Tactical Studies Rules. TSR was the company that produced Dungeons and Dragons. So they were the biggest role-playing company at the time. And they had a UK branch. And the UK branch produced supplements for mostly scenarios and things like that. I'm not quite sure how that happened. You'd have to talk to someone like Brian Ansell to know that. But they arrived en masse, together with a few other people who had worked with TSR, like Graham Davis. I don't think Graham Davis was employed by TSR. I think he was just a freelancer, but he came along as well. So we now had a substantial staff, and we were able to do more role-playing as well as board game products, things like that. We actually employed a couple of guys just to do board games. So when it came to doing the 3rd edition, we were much better provisioned, both in terms of design staff and in terms of production staff. And by now we'd built the company up, so we could also manage a fairly good print run, which meant that we could change from that old-fashioned format to hardback books, which at the time were becoming the thing. AD&D, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, had published hardback books, and that was quite a revelation at the time, because before that, the whole role-playing gaming market had been very much black and white printing and saddle-stitched, stapled product, often produced very cheaply, sometimes even on a wet copier like a Roneo machine. So that's where the whole industry really grew from. It was that almost, I would call it hobby level publishing, or yeah. So to do a hardback book was quite a thing, and I can't remember which was the very first hardback book we did. It might have actually been some of the licensed product we did, because at the time Brian was chasing licensed product just to give us more product to sell, in particular RuneQuest and other Chaosium product. RuneQuest was another role-playing game. It is, as far as I know, produced by a company called Chaosium. Chaosium also produced other role-playing games under license themselves, including some Michael Moorcock-derived things like the White Wolf, I think, and Call of Cthulhu products. So Chaosium produced all those things. So we printed those things on behalf of Chaosium for our English editions. Basically, we sub-licensed it, and that gave us not only hardback books, it also gave us the opportunity to do licensed ranges for those things. I can't remember if we published a Lord of the Rings role-playing game at the time, but we definitely produced models for it. Anyway, so we had some experience of printing in hardback books, I think, before we did the 3rd edition of Warhammer. As well as a camera, a bit more money in the bank, and a bigger print run. Hence, if you look at the 3rd edition of Warhammer, it's a hardback book, it's beautifully illustrated, it's marvellously laid. The whole layout for it and production values are very, very high. And this is all hands-on job, pre-digital, remember, this is all done by hand. I think by this time we'd got a very good, competent graphics, I won't say graphics artist, a graphics manager really, but he's a graphic artist called Chaz Elliott, and he had a small department, and he was responsible for a lot of the hands-on design, the overall design that went into that version of Warhammer. And as I say, it's a beautiful job. The actual rules, the game, at this point, our audience had matured a little bit. So the people that had come along with Warhammer 2nd edition or even 1st edition were now, on the whole, a little bit older. They'd grown up with the game. And I remember being at a games day on a panel with Brian Ansell, possibly Hal, there's a few other people, but definitely Brian. And we were basically talking about Warhammer. And the question that Brian posed, he already had this in the back of his mind, obviously, but the question he posed was, would you like Warhammer to be more detailed and more complicated? And of course, everyone in the room went, yeah, that's what we want. Because if you ask gamers if they want something to be more detailed and complicated, they'll always say yes. And I think Brian took this as a kind of a affirmation of where to go with the next version of Warhammer. So the third version is actually a lot more complex. It's quite detailed in many respects, but it's complex on the level of basic mechanics. So there are a lot of modifiers to the charts which tend to swing it one way or the other quite quickly, in my opinion. So Warhammer uses D6s, and you're basically rolling for numbers to hit, to kill, and then to save. And it was that way up until I left, for sure. And you're comparing factors from two sides to get a core number to roll. Well, the problem with having lots and lots of modifiers is that they tend to swing very quickly to 1s and 6s, particularly if you're goblins fighting elves, I found. So I wasn't very happy with the way the system had worked out. I thought it was actually over complex and burdensome to play. And if you've got a unit of 50 goblins, which I did, based singly, which they were, and you were dealing with a system that envisaged having pushbacks, which it did, then having a result which meant that you have to move 50 individual goblins 3 inches back every turn was a bit of a bind, to be honest. But there you are, it was more complex. I thought in the end the complexity didn't overly work and that people muddled through happily, but without necessarily understanding what they were doing. And that was particularly driven home to me when I found that a good section of the combat results rules had in fact been missed out. Because in those days you're doing cut and paste from galleys of text, which are like long toilet rolls of text. You cut and stick down. And obviously what somebody had done is they'd cut, stuck down, and then gone for lunch, come back, got muddled, lost the piece of galley, and started with a new section. So the rules were never complete, yet nobody noticed. The fact that nobody noticed made me think that perhaps no one was really playing it properly. There you go. The magic system was quite complex too, but we did do some really nice army books to go with it. Ravening Hordes, I think, was a get you by. Might have even come out before, actually. And then we did Warhammer Armies, and that was Nigel Stillman and myself, and a few other people, I think. Lots and lots of artwork, lots of freelancers worked for that, all under the supervision of John Blanche, who was basically commissioning all the artwork. Because we were so much bigger by now, we were a bit more compartmentalized. So what we found was that the artists would be working in the art department. I would be working mostly together with the other games designers. In the big games, we had one big room which we all shared. And later on, I had an office I shared with Nigel Stillman, but we were still compartmentalized. You know, we were working as writers, really. So we were writing whatever needed doing, but it copied text for box backs, to games design, to things like White Dwarf articles. So we weren't really games designers, I think. We were more writers, but we're all together. But the fact that this was so meant that we weren't really always aware of what was going on in terms of either the figure design, which was again treated totally separately, or the artists, as I say, or even production to some extent, though we would tend to be brought in to help with production if we need to explain how something was, particularly in editing. So quite often what would happen would be figures would land on our desk. We'd never seen these figures before. We had no idea what they were, what the idea was behind them. I think perhaps Brian himself had probably given instructions to the guys in charge of the figure design, who would pass that design on, or the idea on, to the figure designers who'd come up with the figures, and then they just get through the production process, and then they end up on our desk, and you go, well, what is it? And the guy who's giving it says, well, I don't know. So you go, well, what's the idea behind this? And the chap says, oh, it's some sort of this, that, or the other. And you go, okay. So you then have to write it up. But you didn't really get much of an idea. There was no joined up thinking. A lot of these things weren't very joined up. And sometimes you would be aware of a project because Brian had sent a memo around, so you'd have an idea of what you were supposed to do. But often you didn't. And you just made up something. Usually a little story to go with the models, like Goblobbers and things like that, or Goblin Chieftain's Chariot. And those little stories often became like seeds of world building. And then give it some stats. You got until 5 o'clock, so obviously you didn't have time to play test it. You just did it off the top of your head. So you had to rely on what you knew and understood about the game system to make it work. And sometimes that worked better than others. And that's how things tended to go. And 3rd edition was the glorious summation of all of that randomness. You know, there wasn't much joined up thinking, but what was done by each individual department was, I think, to a very good quality, and it all just mashed together. The skill was in trying to make things work in that portmanteau way. And I think that was something which I was quite good at, because that's something I'd been essentially doing all the way through Warhammer, even before to some extent. And that was kind of the Warhammer 3 that I remember playing it, and we did play it, and it was quite an enjoyable game in many ways. It was definitely more of a battle game than the preceding version, because the preceding versions had always had scenario packs and were a little bit more narrative. I think the 3rd edition abandoned that, and part of the reason it was able to do so was because we split off role-playing into a separate game, or a separate ambition. Because we'd employed all these guys from TSR who were role players at heart, they took over the role-playing project. So although I wrote the first role-playing game, me and Richard Halliwell really, and I got left to finish it because Hal went off on another one of his jaunts. The actual role-playing product, the scenarios and all the backup for it, got basically done by these guys rather than me, and it benefited it hugely because they were experienced role players, whereas I was a casual role player really at best. The great glory of Warhammer roleplay, I think, wasn't the core system which I designed, but really all the supplementary material that was done for it. So all credit to them for that. But then that fed back into into what we were doing for the battle game. So it all kind of just evolved. There wasn't much of a plan. I think there was a vision, but the vision was very broad brush. And there'd probably been that vision right from the start. I mean, quite frankly, once you pull on the thread, you very quickly get there. It's something that A does follow, A does lead to B and C and so on and so forth. And I think 3rd edition was the summation of all that. Yeah. After 3rd edition, something really significant happened. Well, 2 things happened. 40k came out. 40k came out 1987. And that really boosted the business massively. Because it was so much great, I mean, it really did take off. So there was a lot more profit being generated. And one thing I'll say about Brian, he was very good at keeping his hand on the costs. The costs of the business were always pushed down. So none of us will pay a great deal. But we considered ourselves quite lucky to be working in the gaming industry. There was no gaming industry really of any size when we started. It took years for my parents to stop badgering me about getting a proper job. The idea of writing games rules for a living was an utter nonsense until we started doing it. And we only slid into it via being general writers and people doing advertising and things like that. So that had changed. The company had become much more profitable. I think our turnover must have been up to about 10 million, thereabouts, of which I suspect about 1 million was being with clear profit. Brian had bought the company from Steve and Ian. So all that profit was essentially money that was going directly to the person that owned it. It was going direct to Brian. So he's trousering roughly £1 million a year in these late 80s. But looking to sell the business on, because he'd obviously built up a good personal fortune, or a good lifestyle at least, but was looking to sell the business and what in those days we termed parachute out. You know, that's me settled for life, I'm done. And he'd kind of been all that old, so, you know, we would be, let's see, I'd be thinking he would be in his early to mid 30s, which is not bad. But that was always his ambition. So he started to set up, or rather he got approached, I think, by a number of people who wanted to buy the business, which gave him an idea of what it was worth. And in the end, the business was sold to Tom Kirby. Tom Kirby structured it as a management buyout. A management buyout means that the management get together and buy out a company. That's not quite what happened. What happened was Tom raised the money, but in order to raise the money, it had to be structured as a management buyout, because the people that were lending the money, the venture capitalists, wanted to know that the people who were running the company would remain with the company and had effectively skin in the game. And the people that were running the company at the time was Tom Kirby, who was just general manager. Brian had already distanced himself from the business, and he had to do that for tax reasons. So he was basically living in the Virgin Isles. So basically he was actually he might have been Guernsey first and then the Virgin Isles, and then he moved back to Guernsey, I think. You do that to avoid paying tax. If you're going to be selling a company for, it would be teens of millions. I think it was about 14 million in the end. If you're going to be selling a company for 14 million, the last thing you want to be doing is paying the tax man £4 or £5 million. So nobody does that. Everybody, and everyone who's sold Games Workshop has done this. You go somewhere and become a tax exile for a while, and after a while you come back. So Brian has done that. So he wasn't there. He wasn't part of the. He wasn't running the business day to day. Tom Kirby was. Tom had Tom was working with the other co-owner of the business, who was the finance director. The finance director owned a smaller percentage of Games Workshop. He was Brian's partner, essentially. So he was there. And then the two people that were essentially running the sales department, the whole of the sales and all of the design, or the studio, I was running the studio, and John Stallard was running the sales. So we kind of assumed we'd grown with the business, and we were now doing that job. So we were brought into the management buyout. So the management buyout included us, plus a new finance director who Tom brought in. And that was the management buyout. Eventually, that was all settled after a period of some anarchy, negotiation and what have you. And during that process, we moved into a new studio. That was part of the buyout process, because the old studio in Enfield Chambers was such a pit with leaking roofs and everything, that we thought we can't show all these venture capitalists around this monstrous pit. And there were, we shared it with a kind of youth employment rehabilitation unit, which was fairly anarchic and a bit, how can I put it, didn't give the best impression of the business. So we'd actually moved, or we were in the process of moving to a new place, and this was underneath the castle. It was off Castle Boulevard, so it's Castle Boulevard studio. This had been newly kitted out, newly converted, and it was actually from a series of it was an alleyway with two warehouses next to it, but it was just beautiful inside and very modern. Hellishly hot in the summer, but we didn't realise that at the time. And so we're showing people around this place. You know, you want to invest in Games Workshop, you want to lend money basically for the buyout. This is our studio. These are all. We had lots of new kit. We got some new Macintosh computers at the time. We had been using PCWs, which were a kind of a rather cheap PC-based computer, green screens. We started to move to Macintoshes, so it was a much more professional setup. Part of the buyout. But the essence of it was I think it was 1991 the buyout happened. I think 1990. Yeah, I think it was 91. I think. So Brian was out, but he was still he was retained as a retainer, so he could advise us, and he would phone up and we'd chat. And so for about 3 years, I think it was in theory, Brian had was operating as a retainer to the business. So we still had access to Brian if we wanted, and he had access to us, and he would phone up and occasionally we'd chat about stuff. But he wasn't running things. So it was our opportunity to bring the business up to date. By this time, it's important to remember we had 40k first edition, which had done fabulously well, but had become completely anarchic. There were supplements all over the place. There were rules all over the place. The ranges had sort of grown quite big, but the actual game was just a complete mishmash. It was like it was a dog's dinner of a game by now. Really, it badly needed a second edition. It'd been out for 4 years. The first one had a big role-playing narrative content. We then updated it with sets of army lists. Brian hated the army lists we did, so we were forbidden from ever reprinting them, which meant a lot of the rules that went in those army lists, it's called chapter approved, were never available anywhere else, so you couldn't get them. It was just a bit of a mess, really. Brian himself had kind of, because 40k was so successful, Brian had dived, people enjoy success, Brian had dived in and done a whole batch of stuff on orcs, which had, again, marvellously anarchic. But there were two volumes that actually got published under Brian. I finished the last one, but there were 3 volumes on orcs alone that were just completely wild. Very exciting, but just mad. Anyway, it was a bit of a mess. Warhammer Fantasy had really fallen off a cliff, mostly because people were playing 40k. So people forget this when they get nostalgic about the 3rd edition. The 3rd edition by this point was really not selling. None of the fantasy ranges were selling. They were quite depressed. 40k was still booming despite being a mess, but fantasy was really pretty dead, to be honest. So I had the job of sitting down and working out, and I did this with John Stallard as well, who's the sales guy. We sat down to what we wanted the Warhammer to be and what we wanted 40k to be in the new product range, and we got a basic idea of that. And the idea of doing big box games, as we call them, so a box full of toy soldiers with the rules in. We said we want to do that for Warhammer 40k and for Warhammer. We'd already done it for, I think the first version was called Space Marine, the first edition of Space Marine, and that was because it was almost like I won't say a board game, but the format of all those little toy soldiers, it was 8mm scale. on sprues. It didn't work any other way. You almost had to produce it that way. It was a big box game, almost more like a sort of Milton Bradley kind of thing. And we'd had some experience doing those kind of games with Hero Quest, which we did for Milton Bradley. So we had done big games in boxes, and we'd put plastics in them. We'd just never done it for a war game before, until we did a Space Marine, and that was that specific kind of war game with Titans. So it was a bit odd. So the idea was there. It wasn't a brand new idea, but Brian had not wanted to do that. He specifically not wanted to do that, and we thought, well, we want to do it, so we did it. The other thing that we wanted to do was produce an army book for each army, and I particularly wanted to do that because I wanted to get a complete guide to basically the background, the buying, how to assemble the army with the army lists, and the rules that were specific to that army in a single place. So you had a one-stop shop for playing Bretonians or the Empire or Orcs or whatever. And again, Brian had not wanted to do that. I don't know quite why, but anyway. So that vision of a game with a single entry point, big box game, and the army list to follow, started then. And it couldn't have happened had we not been part of that management buyout, and had we not now, we were running the company. And those decisions kind of all led to a very big change in Warhammer, because by then I realised that the third edition didn't really work, so I wrote the fourth edition, and I actually did all the basic work over Christmas. It was going to be Christmas of the preceding year. It came out in September, if I remember right.